Julian, welcome to the Gauntlet. You're from my Discord, and people probably don't know who you are. So, well, unless they are also in the Discord, the finest viewers have remembered to go to the description and click on the link and join the Discord. But why don't you give us a sentence or two to introduce yourself?
I'm Julian. Some of your viewers probably do know me through my Twitter, but that one it is long since deleted now. But I had quite a few bangers there. I'm just a quick overview, just like a Catholic film guy, like as in cinematographer. So that's kind of like my background. Nothing too much.
Great. Well, if a question comes up about cinematography, then you'll be set to go.
We'll see.
We will. Right. Should we get started? Round one. Do you want to talk about music, economics, or cosmology?
I know next to nothing about cosmology. My economic knowledge is half remembered stuff I learned in high school. When I was an econ nerd. And I know nothing about music. But
tricky.
I'm gonna say like cosmology.
All right. The universe began with a Big Bang. The universe is a simulation, or the universe undergoes cyclical periods of expansion and contraction. Any of these look attractive, or do you want to re-roll?
Well, I can argue some of these a bit from the theological point. I'm not sure how much I need to argue cosmology.
Fine. Well, a purely theological answer will be perfectly acceptable.
I'll go with universe began with a Big Bang.
All right.
And I'll be arguing the pro.
Okay.
So the main point is Genesis 1, created the heavens and the earth. Literally, we know it started with a start. And to argue against that is to argue atheism. All of the people who oppose the Big Bang, if you actually look into history, it's who actually supported it and who argued it. It was very much a theological point from the start between atheists and, quite frankly, atheists wrong about everything.
And what was the alternative theory? What was the pre-existing scientific consensus before the Big Bang?
Well, it depends on exactly what you mean by before the Big Bang theory. It's like, again, I'm not a cosmology guy. This is like my weakest area of knowledge. Just
that's fair.
But I would say
I think it was a solid state model, as in everything's been the same as it always has. So
well, I think there was a few different theories, but I can't actually argue what they actually were. But regards to the Big Bang itself, in order to actually, if you either have a beginning or it goes on forever, if it has a beginning, you need a creator, and if it goes on forever, it doesn't have a creator, and it exists a priori of itself, isn't it? It's a thing of itself, which is the main argument against it from the atheists, and why the atheists don't like the universe beginning. There's an atheistic issue with the universe beginning of a Big Bang, or if anything, really. If it does have a beginning, we know, and if God exists, it has to have a beginning, and therefore, if God exists, and God does exist, because we have scripture, therefore the universe has a beginning, and I'm really hoping this is going to end badly for me. I've already lost.
I've just done a little bit of research, and apparently Fred Hoyle proposed the steady state theory in 1948.
Fair enough. I think that's the one where it has like everything going on going back ad infinitum, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, much like you were talking about, yes.
Yeah. So, hence, I suspect as a theological, he was theologically as an atheist, because there was as I said, there's quite a big atheistic argument already. A theological component to this discussion between the Big Bang or the other alternative models. And even today, you can see the atheistic argument of trying to create the universe as a simulation. You get and various other fake multiverse stuff. You still see people, atheists mainly, and anti-Christians trying to argue this view of the universe already existed, or like a way to get around this Big Bang Theory issue for atheism. And because essentially, so I just argue fundamental argument. We know God exists from Scripture, therefore the universe began, and the Big Bang is the scientific explanation for that.
Is there another so to sort of split your the horns of your dilemma there? Could there be a distinction between the universe beginning with the Big Bang and the universe beginning in some other form? As in, I guess maybe the implication here is that we are finding a reconciliation between the current scientific consensus and Scripture. But there'd be other people who say that the most straightforward reading of Scripture would produce a series of events that bear very little resemblance to what you read in a modern science textbook. So, are you making a positive case for a microscopic point filled with energy and matter that underwent a period of rapid inflation, and then the formation of matter, and then stars and galaxies producing increasingly complex elements, eventually resulting in us?
Well, I can't really argue that positive case for that. My cosmology knowledge and Big Bang knowledge is amounted to a few things I half remember from YouTube videos half a decade ago. I'm not great at this on this point. So I can't really argue the details of that.
Do you have a view one way or the other, though, about whether the picture largely resembles the cosmological view of the secular world, or more resembles the sort of 7-day creation, for example?
I don't think there's really a contradiction between those 2 points. I'm not an expert on this math, but you can deduce the math. Deduce. Essentially, if you go back to the beginning of time, and you sent forth a series of beam of lights, and each one is a second part. Now, billions of years later, you would see those beams of light going back, and the time between them will not be a second; it will be however long. And so our measurement going back in time is not the same as measurement going forward in time, or at another point in time looking back or forward. So we have a sort of stretched out view of time, and that very much can be consolidated with billions of years and 7 days. It's just that those 7 days would be over billions of years, and it will be, from our point of view, very stretched out. I don't think I explained that very well, but that's the point.
Are you talking about relativity, that time can pass at different speeds for different observers?
It's not relativity. I suppose it will be related. It's so you go for it has to do with the stretching of the universe itself, where the space between each beam of light stretches out. So at the start of the universe, the Big Bang, and you see another beam of light, the space between each beam of light will be stretched out between them, so that from our vantage point now, you would be seeing them coming back in a much longer amount of time. So you'll be recording it at a stretched out, elongated period.
Great. Well, that brings us to we've reached 10 minutes, so that's time up on round one, and I'm going to give you, I think, 12 points.
I'm ready for the.
So
well, that's better than I was expecting.
All right,
so what if
round
I
two.
think I'll give it 6.
Ethics, history, or metaphysics?
Depends on what fields you get. With all of these, it's hit or miss. I'm gonna go with history.
All right. Technological advancements are the primary drivers of historical change. The notion of linear progress in history is a myth, or history moves in cycles.
I feel like the second and third ones are just very similar.
That's true.
But I'll go with linear progress. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so I think I got shut on my side. No, sorry. Guys, the notion of linear progress in history is a myth. I'm going to argue that it is in fact true, and I will argue that it is in fact negative, that the linear progress is downward for the most part.
Okay. Yeah,
that is, we get a greater period and decline, and I'll probably lean heavily on scripture here as well. And I suppose you can basically sum up the argument in the Tolkien description of, we see history is a long defeat, heading with glimpses of the final victory. That's basically what I'm going to argue. And starting with, so we get, start of history, Adam and Eve, things are great, and then, like, as part of the curse, we see degradation of the Adam and Eve and their fruit, and like
so far, very, very convincing. Fits with your argument exactly. Things were very good and got worse. So
yeah, so
far, fitting your narrative.
I'll probably go with you get the decline in the 5 spans, which you see in Genesis. You see the decline in all of these, and then again you see almost like a second fall with Cain murdering his brother. More sin, more decay. They have to introduce more technological layers to us, cities and so forth, and then eventually get to Jesus' resurrection, ultimate victory. And then, as we see, that
that ultimate victory sounds like a thing improving.
Oh, it is both the ultimate victory, but also uncompleted as of yet. When we enter the second, it is the beginning of the second creation. But as part of this, we see a leading towards the final Antichrist, and you eventually end up, as part of that, you see in the part of the prophecy of Revelations of Apocalypse that there's very few Christians at the end. It's very bad just before the end. So we know from scripture that there's an end, and I will argue that because we know from scripture there's an end, from a Christian you can't go from that, and you always have to end up at that end. And we know that before the second coming that it's going to be very bad, but we also know from both Adam and Eve and from the resurrection, we had periods of goodness. Therefore, in order to get from point A to point B, things have to get worse over time. And from a material point of view, as well as a spiritual point of view, we see this as like spiritually, like people far worse off now. You see women basically half naked, like, and it's just going to get worse. And this is comparatively spiritually speaking. But every generation, the old trope of every generation thinks that their children are like, what is the world coming to? But obviously they're correct. Like, if it wouldn't be correct if so many people making these observations, you wouldn't see it correctly. And like, rather, if everyone was making these observations, obviously there's a point to it, rather, to clarify. And the third point, finally, is that this is the historical view of Christendom and of Catholicism, which I belong to. So this is actually the historical Christian view, as opposed to the cyclical one, which is much more non-Christian, much more pagan, or just non-Christian in general. But you do even see these periods of decline, of long periods of decline in the pagan stories, which aren't exactly completely detached from truth. Everything heads towards the apocalypse into Ragnarok in the Norse mythology, which the ones I'm most familiar with, but you see it in other mythologies as well. So it's always, you see all of these in various strands of the actual material is getting worse. Scripture says it's going to get worse, and that it has got worse, etc., and so forth.
Let me read you a couple of bits of scripture and then get your reaction. So one of them would be in Matthew 25 that talks about at the end times, many will turn away from their faith and will betray and hate each other. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. And then similarly, 2 Timothy 3, mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive. These seem to line up with the picture that you're painting. But then, what about Ecclesiastes 1 verse 9? What has been will be again, and what will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And indeed, can't you see that in a way, you see a situation that happens in Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah, and then repeated in Judges, very similar story, kind of painting the ultimate picture of corruption of a city and of the nation that produced it. So you see there that the picture does seem to be in Ecclesiastes, and given that these descriptions are arguably worse than what we're seeing around us right now, that actually it's just the slide into decline of each civilization in turn.
Well, you could, having this decline, somewhat cyclical decline within each civilization, echoing as it getting bigger, or like the smaller increases at the peaks and greater declines, is both work. But these patterns of behavior always repeat, but the repetition is not going to be identical. It's always going to be echoed rather than a one-to-one. Like the Eve to Mary similarities, you see, like from Eve to Mary, Mary is the new Eve, as per Catholic theology. I know you disagree, but this is, you still see this one comparison between Eve and Mary of, she says no, Mary says yes, and through Eve, sin enters the world, through Mary, salvation enters the world. You see these echoes, these comparisons, but they're not done in the same way before, in the exact same way. But the patterns always repeat, and I'd argue, as a general, in history, the patterns are getting worse, would get worse until the final pattern plays out in its worst form.
I suppose you could look at the prophecies in Daniel where there's the statue and the head of the statue, as it like the head is gold and the shoulders and torso are silver, and then there's bronze and iron and clay, and that these represent successive future civilizations at the time that the dream happened. So that would again fit with your idea that it is kind of there's a cyclical. Would it be fair to say that you're happy that there is sometimes a cyclical aspect to it, but nonetheless there is also an overriding trend that is linear over and above the cycles?
Yes, kind of like poetry, like where each verse repeats the one before and the one after and so forth, but nevertheless there's an overarching flow through the line of poetry.
Oh, okay. Well, we've crossed 20 minutes, so let me think of what score I should give you. I reckon 14 is a good score for that.
I'm always expecting like 8. I'm gonna go with. I'm just gonna go cinema theater, like just straight off. Don't worry about that.
This is your round as a cinematographer. All right, here are your options. Casting should reflect demographic realities. Entertainment is the primary use of cinema, or the audience is passive in receiving content. I remember we also ended up having a discussion in the Discord that happened to be on one of the other options that hasn't come up here, which was about whether the visual spectacle is the key thing about cinema. Is that right?
I'll disagree on the use of the word spectacle, but yes, that I have been thinking about that one. If that wasn't the case, I would have the argument right up because I've been thinking about that one for a while now.
Well, I'm prepared to make an exception to the format if you'd rather talk about that than one of these three. Then,
I mean, I can probably give the better argument just because I've been thinking about it.
You've got you're locked and loaded and ready to go. So, do you want to first say what is the assertion that you're actually going to be defending, so I don't butcher it by getting the words wrong?
Well, yes, big believer in words being accurate. Best way to put it is the vision is an inescapable, a critical element of theater, of cinema rather. I should not say theater, because theater and cinema are not the same. So
the visual aspect is, say it again?
The visual aspect of cinema is critical to the existence of cinema. You cannot take away the vision. And I'll probably make a bit of a strange argument. Which most people generally compare cinema to like theater and literature, but that's really the wrong way of thinking about cinema. It's a better way of comparing it to music and to dance. And people view the cinema for the storytelling stuff. But and there is story, and it is a storytelling medium, but it's the wrong way to think about cinema. Like you have in music, you have a story, and there's a critical story, and the story might be quite important, but the story is never like very strong. It's always about, it's trying to communicate an emotional state, a central state, and cinema is much like that in that it's quite central, quite emotional over storytelling, and the stories are quite weak if you actually were to break them down, as opposed to like literature, which is why it's so hard for a proper like novel to be, or any story really, to be brought over into cinema, like, and how much is cut out and butchered and so forth. Like Ben-Hur is like a 6-hour movie, and how much did it cut out?
When you say the story is weak, you're saying that the story is simplified. It's got fewer elements in it.
Yes, it's much more like a story in a short poem where there's
more like a short story. Yeah.
Yeah, but it communicates an emotional idea. Think like the movie Drive. Think about how little dialogue there is, but how powerful the emotions are. Like of how the communication of Gosling's character with yes, I just put up Drive. The woman, the mother across the hall, the emotion that moment is done by in a very quick manner. If you actually look at the screen time, but you get it quite strong just by the looks, how they react to each other. Or in 1917, the desperation of that final scene of like, if you've seen it, you'd remember the scene of what do you call it? The chase, the one down through the battlefield as he's trying to get to the Benedict Cumberbatch's character, the general, to have a message, and you see these explosions going off. Like in this case, the sound effects are important. The music is important to deliver it. But if you just had those sound effects, you won't really get that sense of desperation, him falling down, getting back up. That visual element is necessary. In Jaws, you get that famous scene of the camera pulling back and the zoom in. I forgot the technical name for it, but it's like where the sheriff is like on the seat and he's like, that sense of, oh no, he needs that visual element.
So I think that the counter position that maybe I was taking up in our previous discussion was not so much that the visual element is not critical, but but more that there is in my mind at least, a significant difference between a silent movie and a movie with the sound and music. And in fact, I'd say that is equally different to just listening to a soundtrack. Or listening to a radio play, such as the excellent radio play Ascension, that is, everybody is anticipating that coming out very shortly. But my point is that I think the real nub of the disagreement is probably that I think you see the visuals as being primary, whereas I would see it as being equal to the sound when you consider the significance of a movie.
Yeah, I suppose when you get into a discussion and someone's profession is necessarily undermined, you get a bit emotional just because like directly talking about my profession gets a bit close to home.
Well,
thing. So
maybe I'll invite maybe I'll invite a movie, sound mixer or a composer to argue my side of the case. See if they have the same opinion.
Well, even in the silent movie era, you still had music as a part of it. So but the dialogue was definitely the least important part of it, and still is. The most important thing that sound added to cinema was sound effects. The sound of footsteps, the sound of taking a cigarette out of someone's mouth. All of these very subtle sounds are probably the most important things added. You can, tons of scenes were critically important to. Tons of these sound effects are critically important to really deliver the full effect, but you can still very much get most of the emotions, but it depends on what you're talking about. Like Twin Peaks is that surreal scene in the red room with the little dwarf kind of dancing. You can only get that visually. The sound just helps, but it's and by the same token, the weaknesses of cinema comes with its visuals. You can't. It's very difficult to do cosmic horror in cinema because you need to convey this sense. That's how to convey it. It's much easier to do that through literature, which is why. And cosmic horror is the one horror genre that's actually harder to do in cinema than in literature, in general. But there's tons of examples.
Presumably, the best approach in many cases is a bit like the horror movie trope where you don't show the monster at all, and you just hint at its presence so that the viewer still has their imagination going crazy.
Well, it depends on what the cosmic horror actually is, but it's generally better just to get the emotion of what you're trying to get, or the isolation or the conflict between the paranoia. Just convey that emotion. The best cosmic horror is always just focus on that emotion, at least for cinema, as opposed to grasping it more.
I've often thought that cinema is this kind of meta art form where if you want if you want to produce something that is literature, you can just put text up on the screen with nothing else, and then you've kind of like shown that literature is a subset of it. If the thing that you want the people to experience is just music, you can have nothing on the screen and just play the music to them. But the thing that cinema can do that is unique is the fully immersive experience. And I guess you could have a silent section of the film where it was just visuals, and then you could have another section of the film which was just sound effects and nothing visual.
Well, there are cases of that, but they're always very small and very slim parts of the movie. They're never prolonged. But there are more reasons than that. Just but fundamentally, cinema is we think of it as visual stuff. It's really it's not really a visual medium. Literature is the visual medium. Cinema is a touch medium, if that makes sense.
Oh, go
on. We kind of over 10 minutes, but we'll probably that's kind of an entire theological discussion on its
touch
own.
medium. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
I think if you want to read more on that, read Marshall McLuhan. He's the best guy on that. But there's storytelling is we start off all medium, and then it goes to visuals, which is phonetics, printing visual stuff, and then we interact with movies in a much more touch way.
But
it's a bit
great.
It's a bit different.
Well, I'm going to give you, because I thought you did an excellent job on that, I'm going to give you 16.
Wow, this is real great inflation.
Let's see if you can keep it up. Psychology, elite theory, and theology.
I can't really. I know elite theory, but I can't argue it. I can probably hazard a guess at psychology, because it's kind of necessary for somebody to know it. But I'll go theology.
The existence of evil and suffering disproves God. God predestines those who will be saved, or God is active in the world. And remember, you can argue for or against any of these, remember.
The second one is interesting, but I don't know the Catholic position well enough to argue it here, because it's a bit more complex and nuanced than yes or no. It's a bit closer to the Calvinistic position than most people think, I think. I'll probably go with the third one, God is active in the world.
Okay. Take it away.
Well, the main point is will be to look at what events can only be described in a miraculous venue, and I think the best case to look at is the case of Saint Joan of Arc, of someone who was at the time people fought. The French fought. She was as soon as he won the Battle of Orleans, it was the French were or the people sympathetic to the king were pro Joan of Arc. She's this is a miracle from God, and the English were she's a witch. From the get-go, if you look at the historical stuff, and I only say that because I'm reading a book about her right now, it's so good. But Saint Joan of Arc, with Orleans, it's important to recognize that at this point the English had completely won. The French had basically no money, no manpower. They were in a terrible situation, and the English were just waiting to win the battle. The French had failed to break it. They were quickly bruising, and then Saint Joan of Arc comes, it's like some random maiden from essentially the middle of nowhere. It'll be like just like a random village, no one that's very minor. She comes and she persists, like she basically pushes her way in, like through basically force of character. Comes in, gets some few men, and basically saves this terrible situation for the French. And she herself thinks God, everyone quickly, like the fact that it so quickly became something worked here at the time shows that like there's evidence that like people recognize this, of just the necessary like divine intervention right here. And we see this in other historical examples of like the only way that it could have happened is through divine intervention. Um, like some of it, I hesitate to actually use examples because I'm not good at because I don't know the exact details of those examples again well enough. But like you see this in like even the Reformation, where a lot of the time the French or like the English could have easily gone the other way if it had gone ever so slightly. Like the French had a Protestant king for a while, but he became just Catholic to the situation of in the French Wars of Religion. Like the entire situation, like France should have gone Huguenot. Um, like, but there's clearly some level of intervention there to like push it that way. Or how quickly saints like Teresa of Lisieux became massive. I don't want to use her too much because you're a Calvinist, but and you don't recognize her as a saint. But like she, like 27 years after her death, she was like a worldwide celebrity. And she was like a no one, a random nun, clearly pushed through the will of God. Like these things require some kind of outside intervention.
If God is active in the world, how do you explain all of the suffering and evil that is allowed to happen?
Suffering is good. No, like recognize that like suffering has a
I guess
element to it.
I guess I'm posing to you that the problem of evil, right? If God is,
yes,
all good, and we give him praise for doing things like healing somebody, or making somebody a Christian, or all these kinds of things, wouldn't God get more praise if he did this sort of thing more? And therefore, why doesn't he just heal every illness and cause everybody to turn to him and so on?
Well, suffering is good, and it has a purifying effect on people. Like if people are evil and everyone was like, if everyone was good, that'd just be heaven. That's basically a heaven situation. And like just dealing with original sin and leaving the connotations of that out for a moment, like, and just recognizing the world as it is, of evil that has suffering, rather, has a purifying effect on people. In order to get to heaven, you first need to die. You need that evil to experience the good. You need the purification to become reach a higher level of grace, and you need that consequences for evil to actually get better. King Henry V, I believe, is quoted as saying, like he once said to like one of the French prisoners after Agincourt that he was the punishment from God, or God's punishment against the French for their wickedness. And like before Agincourt, the French nobility was just awful. I mean, they were just terrible, just backstabbing each other all the time, and just other stuff. But in order to have a purification, a cleansing, an improvement of that state, you need that suffering to really be able to go through, to really learn how to actually love.
Very good. All right. Well, we've reached the end of this round, and I'm going to give you I'm going to give you 13 points. And that brings us to round 5, the penultimate round of the game. Technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
That's a difficult one. It depends on what natural scientists you're talking about.
That one's quite a varied category. You never know what you're going to get if you pick natural sciences.
Or Christology. I don't want to accidentally stumble into heresy, that one.
That's a valid fear to have.
I'll go with natural sciences.
All right, let's see the grab bag. There has been no progress in physics for decades. We can and should extend life indefinitely, the sort of Silicon Valley opinion. And a unified theory of physics is the ultimate goal of science.
The first one I know the answer to, but I can't argue. But I'll go with the third one. And again, this is just going to be a theological point regarding universal. So just point
Out
3.
of interest, what is the answer to the first one?
There has been no progress in physics for decades. I'm familiar enough with physics to recognize it, but I don't know the details.
Yeah, go into all the details. Fair enough. All right. So a unified theory of physics is the ultimate goal of science.
Well, case in point, a universal theory of physics would just be God, and therefore God is the ultimate goal of everything. Therefore, it's the ultimate goal of science. And we know it is the ultimate.
Give me my 20 points.
The ultimate, universal theory of physics. Like, what would actually be? It would be a unified physics. A theory, a description of the entire physical reality of the world we live in. Every single thing, that's like the goal. Every particle, every planet, and just as the field of physics, that is what that is describing. And so, what would that actually be like? That would be a description of the heavenly motions. That would be a description of God from a particular view of the universe. A view of God from a particular way of describing God from one way of viewing it. Obviously, it wouldn't be the only way, but like, what is the heavens? What is the universe? As we know from Scripture, it is the glory of God. It is trying to understand that glory in its entirety, and therefore, to understand the glory of God is to understand God, and to understand, because the glory of God, in a sense, is God, and everything is for the glory of God in the physical world, not necessarily our own actions for what we attend, but for the actual universe, that would be God. And physics trying to understand glory, the glory of God, is trying to understand God, and as regarding the ultimate goal of science, physics, is quite frankly the heart. Every part of other science and is very much related to the physical element in some way, more than the opposite. Chemistry requires the physical forces much more than physics requires chemical bonds. Not to say that one or the other, but these interrelate. The chemical constructions of biology, the chemical constructions of planets, of ourselves, and the physical constructions of them. It will be literally the entire universe, and it will connect literally every universal theory of physics. Will give an understanding, if not of all the details, but of the overall picture of it. It might not give the details of hand movement or whatever, as an example. We understand that as an example. So it might not give all the details, but it'll give the overview, and it'll give a very good description of it, of how God presents it in a particular way. It wouldn't go in the Aquinas or the full Catholic, it's done by the praying of angels. That might be true, but you'll get a description of it that would be compatible with that. And because it's taking part of all of science, it is that ultimate goal would be to understand most of the universe in its fundamentals.
I gather that for the early universities, every possible degree was considered to be a degree in theology. It was like a divinity. If you studied physics or you studied maths or you studied literature or you studied whatever you were specializing in, it still came under the broad category of theology, in that it was considered that whatever knowledge you were gaining, you were really fundamentally learning more about God. So it sounds like you would kind of agree with that conception of it, of academia and perhaps education.
Well, just because it's run by atheists and libtards doesn't mean that's not what academia comes out of. Yes, even if it's been perverted.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to go with this question, and I like that. I think you're actually correct. I actually agree with this take that the ultimate goal of science, as in the ultimate, as is the ultimate goal, or ought to be the ultimate goal of everything we do, should be for the glory of God. And whilst maybe there are some other sort of benefits that come out of studying the universe, like you learn about something in physics and then you can use that knowledge to build something that is of value in some specific way. I also do think that it's worth defending the place for the study in a society of the world purely for the purposes of learning more about God. So do you? But what about that second thing that I mentioned? Do you think that's also an independent benefit of science that needs to be concentrated on? And maybe if there was a, I know it's a blunt question in a way, but if there was going to be a percentage split, because I imagine a lot of the funding for research, even in universities, actually comes from industry. So the industry will have certain needs, so they'll want the answers to practical questions, whereas the academics themselves might have more high-minded ideals. So in a perfect system, you're made king emperor, and you're allowed to allocate research at a university exactly how you choose. Are you putting 100% of the allocation just into study of the world for the benefit of learning about God, or 50-50? What do you think?
Well, this kind of ties into that no progress in physics for decades point, in that if you're trying to study it just for the world, you don't really get anything. You end up not learning anything. But if you study it for God, you end up getting a lot of results. It's like the benefit always comes from learning it for the glory of God, not just for yourself.
That's a fair point. Do you think that's why then that physics has stalled, because of their wonky objectives, rather than because they've kind of picked all the low-hanging fruit and stalled?
It's probably the theological answer, yes. Probably not the full detailed picture, but that's probably just like the main fundamental theological spiritual reason, yes. As per everything
Good.
else.
Well, since I liked the direction that you took that question in, I'm going to give you 15 points for that round. How about that? And that brings us to our final round: literature, software and mathematics, or eschatology.
Can't argue eschatology. Can't really. I'll just go with literature because that's the one I can probably come up with an answer with.
The traditional literary canon is overrated. Poetry is the most potent form of literature, or translation is impossible.
What do you mean by most potent form?
Well, it seems to me that a poem is a more highly constrained form than prose, and probably in most cases the average sentence in a poem has like more impact on the reader and has probably had more attention paid to it. And I'm partly thinking this because most poems are like a couple of stanzas, whereas works of literature span vast tomes and go on for thousands and thousands of words. I guess what I'm saying is the way that literature is consumed tends to be you read a sentence and move on, whereas poetry is more of a meditative pursuit, and therefore actually affects you more deeply.
I'm gonna not go off that one because I think that one basically ties into the similar point we made earlier, and it requires a much deeper discussion that I can
Can't
make here.
cover it
So
in
I'm just
10
going to go
minutes.
with the third one. Yeah, it requires a full theological discussion. So I'll go with the third.
Translators will be pleased to hear that the subject is trivially easy to cover in 10 minutes.
Well, I mean, there's much deeper stuff in regards to why, and it kind of ties into other stuff because fundamentally everything ties into everything else. But in this case,
Yes.
the basic argument in this case is much more subtle in that, well, much easier to cover in that it's communication, language, words are a form of communication, and communication on its most basic level is one-on-one. It's between you and God, is like, and God understands perfectly. But the moment there's another person, there's imperfections in that stuff, and we kind of start misunderstanding each other. And the more differences that we have, the harder it is to communicate between people. And language is fundamentally a program of history, of ethnos, and nationhood, of the nation's like spirit and its theology, in the sense that it's like how each nation kind of reacts to God in its own way. Each nation, because language is a product of the nation, of its history, and of it, it comes the fruit of how do you actually communicate all of these details of it? How do you communicate all of these subtle ideas in a way that the other person would understand? And it becomes you can never properly translate any possible meaning. You can just kind of, you might be able to grasp the general idea, but it'll never be the specific, like, and the form that it becomes, different forms have different levels of difficulty, but you'll never be able to properly communicate the message. And the one that it's most impossible with would be poetry, because you can never, because that's fundamentally playing with the language. Like, as a form of poetry, it's like that's language play. It's how it flows and how you talk about it. And you can never really translate the sounds of language, which is why poetry is the hardest to translate. And so it becomes translating these ideas into a different audience becomes really a matter of putting in that one nation's ideas into another nation's ethnos, and from one history to another history, one spirit into another. And the further apart they are, the more difficult it is. It's much more difficult to translate Chinese into English than it is French into English, just because we share much more history with France, much more of a spirit with France. So it becomes much easier from that. And so fundamentally, we can never really properly communicate the full message. And as long as it's two people communicating, all communication becomes somewhat a matter of guesswork.
I wonder, because as you mentioned, you work in cinematography. if you shoot a bit of footage, and let's even to make it even simpler, let's say there's no audio track associated, and then you were to have various people watch the footage from different parts of the world, different cultures. Do you think there's an element of this problem even within cinema where you might have an intent as the filmmaker to communicate something visually? Maybe there's some symbolism in the colors that's particular to you, or the shapes, or you've got certain associations that are subconsciously affecting your choices, and depending on who's watching the frame, they may miss things that you wanted to communicate. They may pick up on things that become significant to them that you didn't even put in and don't experience with your own creation.
Well, I mean, that's basically why half the reason why Marvel movies are terrible.
Because
in order to communicate
with
more people, you simplify the message, simplify the communication.
Interesting.
You get that you get that Tower of Babel effect where it becomes to communicate with everyone. You communicate the most simple ideas. I can only communicate those simple ideas.
There's something about, say, like a fable or like a Bible story or something that is almost a mythic, without getting into the question of the literality or otherwise of early bits of Genesis, but those things are very compelling to people from all cultures, and so I wonder whether how come in that case you can make something that's really beautiful and high art. Oh no, this is literature rather than cinema, but whereas in the case of the Marvel movies, then they seem like such like low shelf schlock that's like becomes diluted and to the point of almost non-existence by the need to be universally. Aren't some of the most universal things also the grandest themes of life? Love, loss, the passage of time, regret, things like this.
Yes, and we all interact with those differently. With fables, they're communicating the very simple truths that can be understood by basically everyone because they're the fundamentals. And with scripture, you're talking what is very integrated, and no one is going to get the full picture no matter what, because there's so much meaning there that it is the highest art and the highest literature, and but even like the fundamental truths is like can be very much understood from it, like in the sense like the main messages like everyone understands on scripture. What is essential is much more understandable than the stuff that requires centuries of debate to work out the figure of what it actually means. Regarding a lot of the stuff with Mary, took centuries of debate to come to a consensus on, and a determination, at least within the church. And so and then with Marvel stuff or that kind of shock, what they're trying to communicate is in the middle, I suppose, between very simple truths. They communicate slightly deeper truths, but those truths are best expressed in a way that's understood by that nation in a particular way.
Very good. Well, I'm going to give you 14 points for the final round, and that brings us to the high score table. Let's see how you've done. If I refresh, there you are, and you're in 4th place, just ahead of Poe, just behind Academic Agent. Congratulations, very very good result. How do you
ahead of a woman?
Well, once upon a time, Poe was top of the leaderboard. So there was.
pulled that out of my ass.
Well, or did she come out?
Well,
Did
considering
she?
I
Was she
pulled
before
most of
or
those
after
arguments
Joe
out of my
Biden?
ass as I was arguing them.
And look at all these other people who you've completely dominated.
Yeah.
Well. Before finishing, I might
So
just
true.
give a plug for a couple of things. One is, of course, the Discord, which is you're in the Discord, Julian. That's where that's how you managed to get on the show. The Discord was originally started from my other channel, Lambda Bible Studies, and it has channels both for the more kind of broad topics like politics that get discussed on this channel, and then also theological stuff that gets covered on Lambda Bible Studies. So come along if you're interested in any of the stuff that I cover on either of those channels. We're very keen to have people, especially if you're a seeker, as the kind of slightly cringe term is, right? That if you're somebody who's interested in Christianity, finding your feet in your faith, you've got questions, that's actually a really nice little community to come and discuss things with. And of course, if you're not subscribed to Lambda Bible Studies, you should consider doing that. And actually, I have a third channel now to promote, which is Lambda Media, which currently just contains 2 trailers for the up-and-coming radio play Ascension, which I'm very hard at work producing. And it's going to be awesome. And it's going to come out in just a matter of somewhere between days and weeks, depending on various things. It's pretty close. I'd say we're on the final straight of getting that together, and it's coming together very well. So you don't want to miss that. Go and subscribe to Lambda Media. Go and subscribe to Lambda Bible Study. Join the Discord. Any other plugs? I suppose the booking is open for the weekend retreats that I'm running over the summer. This will be the 3rd time that happens. I've not been pushing it that hard because I've got so many other things to plug at the moment. I will probably go into overdrive getting people to sign up for that after Labster is finished, as in after I've finished doing all these episodes of the Gauntlet and released the radio play. But the weekend retreat is there's a few dozen people show up, and we study the Bible and pray together and worship. But actually, about half the people who come are not necessarily Christians. They don't attend church regularly. They're just kind of trying to figure things out. So I've also got a link in the description to sign up form for that. So I highly recommend. That's the biggest commitment, to take an entire weekend out of your life, and also you have to pay some money for that. But people who've come on it before have said it's really some of them have really said it's changed their life. Everybody's had a pretty good time who's come, but who knows, for you it could be really significant. So I'd love to see you in person if you want to come along to that. Good. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Julian.
No worries.
All
Good to be here.